The letters started arriving the second week we moved into our new house. It was an ordinary Tuesday when I found the first batch in the mailbox, a mix of junk mail, a couple of bills, and a handwritten envelope addressed to someone named Maria. I set it aside, intending to drop it back at the post office, marking it "Return to Sender." But the letters kept coming. Each day brought a new one, sometimes two. By the end of the week, a small stack sat on our entryway table, each inscribed with Maria's name. They were like whispers from the past, infiltrating the calm of our new life. Curiosity got the better of me. Flipping through a diary found among the mail, my eyes caught phrases filled with fear, someone watching, someone waiting. I felt a shiver creep up my spine. Maria's words were a mirror to my unease about the silent rooms and the 2 still nights in our new house. Then the tone of the letters changed. It wasn't just Maria's absence they lamented. They were warnings, desperate and dark. One morning, a letter lay on our porch, a picture of our house taken from the street tucked inside. "Maria, they're not you. They won't do," the jagged handwriting on the back read. The compulsion to seek answers overtook me, and I found myself at the local police station, the stack of unopened letters clutched in my trembling hands. The desk sergeant led me to an interview room where I poured out the story of the persistent mail for Maria. The officer across from me listened intently, his features etched with concern, and then he shared a chilling piece of the house's history. Maria had lived there before us and had disappeared without a trace, her case remaining unsolved and cold. The letters became a daily dread. With each arrival, my paranoia grew. I started looking over my shoulder, jumping at shadows. The kids' laughter sounded hollow, unable to chase away the cold fear that settled in my chest. A thud on the front door startled us one evening during dinner. A thick envelope was wedged under the doormat, heavier than the others. I could barely breathe as I tore it open. "Tomorrow," was all it said. That night, we didn't sleep. My husband and I sat in the darkened living room, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house. The kids camped in the living room with us, a pretended adventure to mask our vigil. Morning light brought no relief. The letter's promise hung heavy in the air. We waited. The kids asked questions we couldn't answer. We tried to stay normal, but our forced smiles were as thin as the silence that enveloped us. As dusk approached, the world outside turned a menacing gray. My heart raced at every passing car, every rustle of leaves. We clung to the illusion of safety, the locked doors, the phone always within reach. But inside, we all felt it, the impending breach of our family sanctuary. The day's mail lay forgotten on the floor, the last of Maria's letters unopened. Its presence was a taunt, a final piece of a puzzle we didn't want to complete. We were in the heart of the unknown, the hour of the unknown threat creeping closer with the night's shadows. As the evening wore on, the tension in the house became tangible, like a heavy curtain that draped over us, suffocating and thick. Every sound was amplified, every silence loaded with meaning. The children tried to play board games, their laughter forced and brittle, while my husband and I exchanged tight, worried glances. A knock at the door shattered the strained peace, sending us into a frozen silence. My husband motioned for the kids to go into the kitchen as he moved toward the front door. I followed close behind, my pulse racing in my ears. Another series of knocks, urgent and heavy, beat against the door. My husband called out, his voice steady but strained. "Who's there?" There was a pause, then a reply, a voice rough and low. "A friend of Maria's." I could barely hear myself think over the sound of my own heartbeat. My husband looked at me, a silent question in his eyes. I nodded, a silent assent. He unlocked the door, opening it just a crack. The man on the porch was nondescript, his face half hidden by the brim of his hat. "You need to leave," he said simply. His voice was devoid of emotion, but his message sent a chill down my spine. "Why?" my husband demanded. "What happened to Maria?" "She knew too much," the man replied, and something in his tone suggested he wasn't just talking about the woman who had lived there before us. We didn't wait for further explanation. Packing only essentials, we ushered the kids into the car. As we drove away, I took one last look at the house, the setting sun casting long shadows across the facade. We stayed at a motel that night, the anonymity of the place a small comfort. The kids slept restlessly, while my husband and I talked in hushed tones. We decided to sell the house, to leave this chapter behind us. It wasn't just about the letters or the man. It was the feeling of being watched, the sense of threat that now hung over our lives. In the days that followed, we learned more about Maria. She had been a journalist, one who dug too deep into stories that were meant to stay buried. Her disappearance was a warning to others who might follow in her footsteps. The letters stopped once we moved, but the fear remained. I started looking over my shoulder, distrustful of shadows and strangers. Our new beginning had been tainted, our sense of security shattered by the realization that some things are too dangerous to ignore. We never did learn what Maria knew or why it mattered so much. But the experience left us with a new set of rules, unwritten but deeply ingrained. Stay aware, stay safe, and sometimes, just sometimes, it's better to leave the past undisturbed. Moving day brought a mix of excitement and chaos as we unloaded boxes into our new home, a neat little place with a big backyard for Duke, our dog. But as soon as we opened the door, Duke froze, refusing to go in. It was strange. Duke was always the first one in, usually exploring every corner with his tail wagging. Ignoring his behavior for the moment, we got to work setting up our new life. But as night fell and we settled in, Duke's unease became impossible to ignore. He wouldn't come inside, and at the edge of the yard, he growled at the house like it was a stranger. I started losing sleep. Duke's growls turned into barking sessions every night, aimed at the kids' rooms. Something wasn't right. This wasn't like him. In the middle of the night, I'd peer out to see him, his eyes fixed on their windows, and I couldn't help but feel a tingle down my spine. By the third day, fed up and needing sleep, I turned the house inside out looking for whatever it was that had set Duke off. I tapped walls, checked for loose floorboards, even looked up the chimney. Nothing. The weekend brought a chance encounter with the neighbor while getting the mail. He looked at Duke, then at the house, and shook his head. Previous owner had a dog that acted the same way, he said, leaning in close. Disappeared without a trace. I laughed it off, but inside, my heart was racing. The kids started to complain about being watched. They'd hear scratches in the walls at night, whispers of movement that sent Duke into a tailspin from the other side of the window. Their eyes, wide with genuine fear, left no room for doubt. Our new home had issues. I called a dog trainer, a guy with years of experience with troubled animals. He watched Duke for a while, and then suggested setting up cameras. "Let's see what he's seeing," he said. We put cameras in every room, hoping they'd give us some answers. Night after night, we watched the footage, but it only showed Duke, staring intensely at nothing. The rooms were still, lifeless, yet Duke was fixated on something we couldn't see. One evening, as the sun set, Duke's barking reached a fever pitch. In a turn of events, he was now inside, his body rigid and barking furiously at the closet under the stairs. It was as if some invisible force had compelled him to enter to protect us. His barks echoed through the house, filling the space with a sense of urgency. I hesitated, my hand on the doorknob, feeling like I was about to open Pandora's box. The closet was filled with old coats and boxes, but Duke's barking didn't stop. Pushing aside the clutter, I found a false back, and behind it, a small, hidden room. The air felt cold as I looked inside. There, amid dust and cobwebs, were scraps of clothing and old, battered toys. My heart skipped a beat. For the first time since moving in, Duke crossed the doorway and sat down in the kids' room, his body between them and the closet. He was still and quiet, but his eyes never left the closet door. I spent the next day clearing out that hidden room. With each toy and piece of tattered clothing I removed, the house felt a bit lighter, like I was lifting a curse. Since then, Duke hasn't growled at the house or the kids' rooms. He's back to his old self, and the kids sleep through the night. I still don't know what was in that room, what history it held, but I do know that whatever it was, It's gone now, and so is the fear. It's been quiet since then, normal even. But every so often, when the house creaks or the wind howls, I catch Duke lifting his head, his ears perking up, as if he's remembering something we can't. But then he'll look at me, give a soft huff, and lay his head back down. And I'm reminded that whatever it was, we faced it together, and we're safe now. After the discovery of the hidden room, the atmosphere in the house shifted. It was subtle at first, the way the air felt lighter, the way the floorboards no longer creaked with the weight of unseen presences. Duke was calm now, his nights spent curled up at the foot of the kids' beds, his watchful eyes softening as if he knew the danger had passed. The kids were laughing again, their earlier fears replaced by the typical childhood worries about homework and friends. They played in their rooms without the subtle glances towards the closets or the sudden, inexplicable shivers. It was as though they too could feel the house had exhaled, released from a long-held breath. But the hidden room stayed with me, like a shadow at the edge of my vision. I didn't tell the kids, but I sealed it up myself, putting up new drywall and painting it over, turning it once more into just a wall, into nothingness. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had uncovered something private, something that was meant to stay hidden. The dog trainer called once, asking for an update. I told him about the room, about the clothes, and the toys. There was a silence on the line before he simply said, "Well, dogs sense things we don't. Maybe Duke just did what he had to do." I thanked him, ended the call, and hoped it was that simple. Duke's behavior was back to normal, but he was different, more reserved, as if carrying a burden. He'd spend hours sitting by the kids' door, his gaze tracking the play of light and shadow on the hallway floor. Sometimes at night, I'd find him staring at the new wall, his head tilting in confusion or recognition. I couldn't tell which. Life went on, and the house became just a house again, our home. We celebrated birthdays, hosted barbecues, and hung pictures, creating new memories over the old. Yet sometimes, in the still moments of the evening, I'd catch myself staring at the sealed wall, wondering about the stories it held. I didn't notice at first, but it was Duke who reminded me that not all was right. It started with small things, him avoiding certain spots in the house, or the occasional low growl at an empty hallway. The kids didn't notice. They were blissfully unaware, caught up in their world of games and laughter. But I knew Duke hadn't forgotten, and neither had I. The house might have been silent, but the echoes of its past whispered in the corners where the light didn't quite reach. I made a decision then. We wouldn't live in fear or ignorance. I sat the kids down, told them a version of the truth, that the house was old and had many previous owners, and sometimes that meant finding surprises in the nooks and crannies of our home. They nodded, accepting the story with the unquestioning trust of the young. As for Duke, he got extra treats and belly rubs, and we thanked him for being our protector. At night, I'd still hear him sometimes, a soft whine, a shifting body as he kept vigil. And in those moments, I'd join him, sitting in the darkness, listening to the silent house breathe. We found the old homeowner's manual the day we moved into our new house. It was tucked away in a dusty corner of the attic, its leather cover cracked and pages yellowed. We laughed about it over dinner, reading out the bizarre rules like never hang pictures on the north wall and the attic must remain empty at all times. They seemed like the ramblings of a superstitious old fool. That first night, we broke a rule. My wife, Jess, placed an antique mirror in the hallway against the north wall. The kids joked about our rebel spirits as they danced in front of their distorted images. But later, as I walked by, I could have sworn my reflection moved independently, a split second too slow. I shook my head, blaming the odd sensation on the exhaustion of the day. Then we broke another rule. Jess received a bouquet of red roses from her new job, and she put them in the front room. That night, as we slept, a sharp floral scent filled the house, growing so intense it clawed at my throat, waking me in a coughing fit. I stumbled to the front room and found the windows inside scratched as if by thorns, though the roses lay undisturbed. I tossed and turned the rest of the night, unsettled by the impossibility of it all. In the morning, I found more signs that something wasn't right. Our TV turned on to static, loud and jarring, though it was unplugged. Doors slammed shut, and faint knocking echoed through the walls. We all felt it, a heavy dread settling in the pit of our stomachs. The children complained about whispers in their rooms at night and cold drafts that made their bones ache. Jess and I exchanged worried glances but tried to keep a brave face. "It's just an old house settling," I lied, but lying became harder each day. After a week of minor but unnerving events, we decided to follow a rule to the letter. Always leave the third step from the bottom of the stairs clear after sunset. It felt ridiculous, but that night was the first in a week where the house remained silent, and a peaceful sleep found us all. It was enough to make us believers. We scoured the manual, making notes, setting alarms to remind us of the most critical times and places. We adjusted our lives around the rules, and for a while, it worked. The house seemed to grow calm, almost content. But life isn't always predictable. One evening, we forgot to leave the attic empty. A box of Christmas decorations was left out. That night was the worst of all. Our dog barked furiously at walls, her hair standing on end as if she saw something we couldn't. A low growl, not from the dog but from the house itself, filled the rooms, and shadows danced just out of sight, skittering away when we tried to look directly at them. In desperation, I went to the attic to put the box away. As I climbed the stairs, a chilling sensation washed over me. I wanted to turn back, but I pushed on. As I reached the top, I felt something brush against my hand, like the fingers of a child trying to take mine. I dropped the box and ran, not stopping until I was out on the front lawn, gasping for air. We couldn't go on like this. We decided to delve into the history of our home. The town's records were scant, but gossip was plenty. We learned about the original owner, a man who was deeply invested in the occult. He had disappeared without a trace decades ago, leaving behind the manual and a house that didn't take kindly to being disregarded. We knew we had to leave, but something made us stay. Maybe it was the money we'd sunk into the place, or the stubborn belief that we could somehow beat it at its own game. Either way, we were determined to make it through. I sealed the attic, triple-checking that it was indeed empty. We marked each rule with a different color of sticky note, placing them all around the house. We became slaves to the manual, jumping at timers and alarms, each one a reminder to check, to secure, to obey. As long as we followed the rules, the house was quiet, but the threat loomed over us, an ever-present shadow, waiting for the moment we slipped up. It was a life on edge, a life dictated not by us, but by the caprices of a home we once loved. Living by the rules in the manual became our new normal. The house remained calm, but the tension never dissipated. It hung in the air like static before a storm. Our conversations were often punctuated by glances towards the nearest rule reminder, the sticky notes adorning our walls like bizarre decorations. One particularly hectic morning, the balance we had so carefully maintained was disturbed. In the rush of preparing for a school event, the third step rule was forgotten. By the time I remembered, the sun had set, and a cold dread settled in my chest. That night, the house seemed to come alive with a malevolent energy. The growling returned, low and ominous, vibrating through the floorboards. Shadows flickered in the corners of our vision, more tangible than ever, as if something was just on the verge of manifesting. The air grew thick, oppressive, and I could barely breathe. The children huddled in our bedroom, their eyes wide with fear. Jess and I stood back to back, clutching each other's hands, as the sounds of the house intensified, a cacophony of unexplained creaks and groans. Then, all at once, it stopped. The silence was deafening. We waited, not daring to move, not daring to hope. After what felt like hours, I ventured out, the manual clutched in my trembling hands. I made my way to the attic. Each step felt like an eternity. At the top, I hesitated, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. But I had to know. I pushed open the attic door and peered inside. It was empty, as the rule dictated, but the air was icy, and I could see my breath. I felt eyes on me, though I was alone. Whispers filled the room, too soft to make out any words. I stepped inside, determined to end this. Why? I asked the empty space. Why are we being punished? There was no answer, only the feeling of sadness, thick and tangible. It was as if the house itself mourned its existence, its history of occultism and isolation, its unbreakable rules. We respect the rules, I said. We want to live here in peace. Please, let us. The temperature started to rise, the chill receding gradually. The whispers faded away, and for the first time since we moved in, I felt a sense of release, of forgiveness perhaps. We continued to live by the manual, but it felt different now. The house seemed to have accepted us, its new occupants. The sticky notes remained, but they no longer felt like threats. They were simply part of the house, part of our lives. Months passed without incident, but the sense of unease never fully left us. We were caretakers of a legacy, bound to a set of rules that we'd never understand. Yet, within those constraints, we found a life worth living. Our life in the house with the manual was a life on a knife edge, always one step away from chaos. But it was our life, our home, and we'd learned to live with its quirks. The shadows and whispers became just another part of our story, a story that continued, bound by the pages of a yellowed, leather-bound manual.